Welcome, dear listeners, to the Unique Retelling semi-hiatus era. So this is basically how it's going to work. Like I said in the last episode, due to the strike as well as additional time constraints, there are a number of episodes that I was never able to upload. That includes our episode on the 1974 Great Gatsby starring Robert Redford, our double feature of both La Belle et la Bête, The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter, the Norse mythology episode, the Green Knight episode, and of course, arguably the most anticipated one, our table read of Ben Crew's fan script of Muppets Present The Great Gatsby. And that's not even going into the hours upon hours of outtakes that I want to eventually release. So basically, until I get at least the main episodes done, we are going to be slowing down on new recordings. Not completely stopping because, of course, retelling the news will still definitely be going on. And additionally, Shami and I do have a new episode coming up where we're going to be reviewing a book before it's actually released. So that's going to be really interesting. I'm going to do my best to make sure we finish these episodes as soon as possible, but if there is ever a week where I'm unable to, of course, you're just going to get another In Each Retake special. Cool? Cool. Now, with that all out of the way, please enjoy the very first episode that was delayed due to the strike, The Great Gatsby, 1974. Oh, and remember, the views and opinions expressed on this podcast are solely those of the speakers.
In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you have had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments.
It was a matter of chance that I should have decided to spend the summer on that slender, riotous island which juts out into the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound, 20 miles due east of New York.
Welcome to In Each Retelling, Old Sports, the podcast where we explore all the ways old tales are made new. Gatsby Month continues to go strong. I am your host, Jasmine Garcia, and joining me today are...
My name is Justin Bailey. I am here again. Next week was when I was last here.
I do not think I can top that intro, but I am Shami.
How do you do, old sports? I'm Bryan Harris.
I think we're all old sports on this bus.
Oh, yeah.
We can't all be Gatsby.
Oops, all Gatsbys. All jokes aside, we are now going to be discussing the Robert Redford version of The Great Gatsby that was released in 1974. The one that I despised as a 16-year-old in English class, mainly because of the way they handled Gatsby's entrance, but we will get into that further. All right, so Justin has already discussed his own history with The Great Gatsby. So our newcomers to Gatsby Month, give us a little bit of background into your own history with The Great Gatsby.
So even though I'm from Toronto, we did also have to cover The Great Gatsby for English class, 11th grade. It always seems to be that. And then we did watch the Robert Redford version. This was during like the early 2000s, but we had these like little Willy Wonka TVs that they would wheel out during the English class, and we would watch movies on it. But because of technology at the time, no closed captioning, so I could barely follow what was going on.
Yeah, the sound quality isn't that great in this movie, so yeah, I can understand that being even more of a problem.
So this movie is actually my first time experiencing The Great Gatsby in any form.
Ooh.
Movie, book, or otherwise. For whatever reason, The Great Gatsby book was just never on any of my required reading lists in school. It just never... I, of course, knew about The Great Gatsby and knew about the characters and some of the themes just through cultural osmosis. But I was never assigned to read the book, never saw a movie version before this. When I come on this podcast, if you have me back again,
Of course.
You're going to hear that a lot, that I haven't read certain books. Just wasn't a really big reader growing up. And as an adult, I just find it hard to find the time to be able to read books, even the recent books, let alone the classics. I do remember that in one of my classrooms in middle school, there was this poster on the wall of the cover of The Great Gatsby with the eyes and the lips. And I always found it kind of intriguing, but also creepy looking, because it's just that blank face amongst like a night sky. So
You know, you're not wrong, but I feel like that's actually kind of part of the reason they chose that particular cover. It's very beautiful, but very unsettling.
yeah, exactly. And it kind of draws you in.
Which I think fits the story very well.
The other adaptation I've seen is like the 2013 version. It was just so much bling and so much opulence. It's just it's focused. It feels like it focused more on the set design and everything than characterization and the story, which I don't think is a good idea. But it does accurately portray the 20s, like that sort of like decadence and opulence.
Yeah, we kind of went into that. They definitely got that part very much right in terms of adaptation.
And then I did manage to read part of like Self-Made Boys, which is Anna Marie McLemore, their adaptation of The Great Gatsby, which features like Nick as a trans Latino and Gatsby as a trans man. Again, accessibility is a very important thing because I cannot find a digital copy anywhere.
Yeah, that definitely is part of the problem. It can be hard for people to get access to certain books depending on where they are, and it's a shame. I was lucky and was able to find it on my library app, but we'll get further into that on that episode. Preview of coming events. And in that case, so upon revisiting this particular version of it, I have to say I definitely grew more of an appreciation of it about half of my life later. Dear God. I am Nick in that moment where he realized he just turned 30. I will say, Grady had mentioned this in the chat. He was in our previous full-length episode. The opening is spectacular. You see all of this opulence in Gatsby's mansion, but it's empty. And doesn't that just sum it all up?
Yeah, and the way the film ends, it sort of implies that it's not cyclical, but, you know, the movie ends where it begins. It's the same sort of series of shots. You even have the same egg sandwich that his dad was eating. And hey, his dad is actually here this time.
Yes, it was nice that an adaptation did address Mr. Gats, because Ben Crew mentioned that was one of his favorite parts of the book, and I have to agree. It is a very heartwarming, humanizing moment, even though Gatsby is gone by the time he arrives.
Yeah, I also like the opening. It was kind of haunting, and you just sort of hear that song being played on like it's like a recording just sort of being blasted through the empty halls of the mansion. So pretty good sound editing.
Yeah, Grady had specifically said how we are just as haunted by Gatsby as Nick winds up being. And this is before, much like Bryan, this could have been someone's first introduction to this story, so it's kind of interesting. I also really find it interesting that in this version, they very much emphasize that not only has he been following Daisy's whole life, he is out and out making like scrapbooks. He's keeping photographs.
Stalker alert.
You know what? Of all newly public domain stories to make it to a horror film, I'd be fascinated to see somebody try that with The Great Gatsby. It's actually very easy to do so, because you know, the trailer for the 2013 film uses this like rock version of Happy Together that was also used on the soundtrack for the remake of The Stepfather.
Imagine me and you, I do.
I'm certainly glad to see you again.
I think about you day and night. It's only right.
I'm certainly glad to see you as well.
So happy together.
I wish we could just run away.
I've just heard the most shocking thing.
You and me!
It all makes sense.
Me!
You can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past.
So it's like, you are already kind of leaning into that. Like, do it. As much as I do adore Jay Gatsby as a character for all of his faults, like, you could easily write him as a horror villain.
Yeah, Gatsby standing in a room with Nick, he just like pauses, he just, who am I right now?
Yes. Oh.
Oh, that fits way too well.
So after the still shot, that's when we get into the opening lines again, and we see Sam Waterston messing up in the water, right?
He just looked like a sad wet borzoi.
Yeah, it was an interesting way of introducing our, well, I mean, technically he's our main character, but Nick, up until towards the very end, he's such a non-presence in this movie, I feel like. Like, he is barely in this, really.
In the beginning he is, but as the romance between Gatsby and Daisy starts to rekindle, I think that's when Nick has to take a step back so that we can focus on this Gatsby, Daisy, Tom love triangle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like they're in a bubble and like Nick is just outside of it, just looking in like an omniscient reader.
Yeah, his third wheel vibes is arguably at its lowest in terms of adaptations that I have encountered. Like, he is the least present in this quote-unquote love story. Although, what I do find fascinating about this particular adaptation is, yeah, you definitely see Daisy and Jay having a lot more actual conversations about things. Like, they're actually talking things out like an actual couple would, which I thought was an interesting choice.
Yeah, that was a big thing that the screenwriter, good old Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah.
When he was reading the book, he was thinking, well, it's this dynamic that's like the thrust of the whole narrative, and they basically don't talk to each other. So he spent a lot of time in the original script sort of flushing out the romance, and then I guess they didn't use most of it.
Which is wild, because, yeah, this is still definitely more development of the actual relationship itself rather than the idea of the relationship that I've ever seen, which on the one hand definitely makes it a little bit more interesting. Like, I do find their dynamic in this version very fascinating. It's partially because Mia Farrow I think she might be my favorite in terms of actresses who have played Daisy. Like, she understood the assignment. Like, all of the artifice, but the hidden depths, you can absolutely see them just bubbling over sometimes. And I think, and what's interesting is she's kind of feeding into Gatsby's idea that they can just turn back time and get back to the way they were.
Or her performance kind of reminds me a little bit of like Blanche Dubois from Streetcar Named Desire. Like, she's holding on to like her, like the old South ideals, like her family values, her house. And then she just all falls apart at the end. And I feel like Daisy in another story could have easily ended up like Blanche.
Oh God, that would be heartbreaking. I mean, because yeah, she is a careless person, but like I said in the previous episode, I find this character fascinating of who she could have been in a world that gave her more opportunity to not have to finagle her way into any sort of comfort.
Being in the last episode and sort of expanding how much I know about this work and like people's sort of interpretation or reception of it, I guess like Daisy is like a really disliked character overall. They're like, oh, I can't stand her. I can't. And like, I really don't get it. Like, even when I was just reading the original book, it's not that she's not hateable. She's pitiable. It's like everything about her is just so sad because she feels trapped and doesn't know what she wants. Like, she's so trapped by the love that Gatsby was offering to her, and she's like, but I can't marry you because, in the period of time that we're in, it would be marrying down, and you're just some guy. And then, Tom Buchanan sweeps into her life, and like, it's kind of the only option. And yeah, she just sort of feels compelled to play the part. And now that she has options, or at least is given the possibility of an option because of Gatsby's infinite hope, she's like, fuck, I have a kid now.
Yeah, and they emphasize that in this film. I actually really loved that Pammy was kind of actually something of a presence in
she was there.
She was there. Exactly. Like, Pammy didn't show up until the very end in the 2013 film. And one of the few parts of Robert Redford's performance I really, really loved, because I am sorry, this was definitely not his best work.
No, I know.
But we'll get into that, because thanks to the Ben Crew interview, I did find out something very interesting regarding that. But one of the few acting moments I really loved for him was the moment where Pammy kind of shows up and he's just kind of looking at her like, you can kind of see that the illusion is crashing down for once. And I think that does kind of fuel his response to the confrontation. Like, he's just like, no, we are staying the course, because otherwise this is going to be too painful.
You can see the desperation.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other part I really loved was the moment he and Daisy reunited. Just, that she first sees him through a mirror. It reminds me of what Sam had said in the previous episode about how much she wishes they had seen each other through water, like Romeo and Juliet had in the Baz Luhrmann version. So it's just like, that was such a good shot.
I guess in this adaptation, the thing that I also thought was interesting, so in the Baz one, Gats is sort of ineffable. He just kind of like, you don't really get a grasp of what his deal is. You know, some moments he's like manic, some episodes he's like effortlessly cool, some moments he's psychotic. In this version, you can kind of feel his awkwardness around Nick, especially when they first meet. When they first interact, it's like he says something and then Nick like pauses for like 5 seconds and then he responds, and then fucking Redford like is looking at him like, right, okay, yeah, we'll get into it. But the thing that I think is interesting about this version of Gatsby is, for me, he feels much more like a thug. Like, this version of Wolfsheim is much more shady than in the previous one that we talked about. In this one, they sort of emphasize him being a threat as opposed to the unfollowable mess of that scene that was in the 13 version. But in this one, it's like you can kind of feel that, you know, this guy is old time, like maybe a mobster, maybe a gangster, but like you can kind of feel that you don't mess with this guy. You don't get in his way. And even the way that Gatsby was sort of playing into the killing someone thing, where Nick was like, yeah, I heard you killed a guy, and he's like, just a guy? Just one?
That is true. I didn't even think of that, but yeah, God, my 16-year-old self was just like, see, this entrance is terrible, because it's just, when you read the book, like, Nick is immediately fascinated by Gatsby.
Enamored.
He really is. We've discussed this. They're in love. We know this. It's just, with this, there is none of that energy. Nick just wants to get out of there. And going back to Robert Redford, just not giving that vibe of him being so enigmatic. And interestingly enough, what I found out was, apparently while they were filming this, Watergate was happening, and pretty much anytime he wasn't filming, Robert Redford was glued to the news. So, like, he did not give a fuck.
Well, yeah, he was doing research for All the President's Men.
It's true.
You could tell he was so distracted during this time. Like, I felt like almost putting on a mask.
The dialogue, I think, is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for Robert Redford's character, and to his credit, I think he delivers the dialogue well.
Oh yeah.
Like I said, this is my first time experiencing Gatsby in any form, so I'm sure you guys probably already have like your favorite actor who's played Gatsby like already in mind. But for me, as like a complete newcomer, I guess I was fine with it.
Yeah, it's not even that he was bad at it, because I don't think Robert Redford's like has it in him to give a bad performance from what I have seen of him. Like, he's definitely iconic. He
wasn't invested in it.
Exactly. This was not his best work, is the thing.
Yeah, this isn't 3 Days of the Condor. This isn't Jeremiah Johnson. This isn't Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. This isn't, he's been in like an infinite number of films. So, like, you know, is he kind of sleepwalking? Maybe.
Also, I just felt like he was a little bit too old for the part.
Is that why they changed it to 8 years instead of 5, you think, maybe?
Maybe.
Yeah, I was thinking that as well. Like, that was sort of like this obvious line, because they seem to still imply that they met when she was 18 or 19. But for him, it seems like he was in his 20s during the war.
I think she directly said she was 18 at one point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because this is a fairly loyal adaptation. It definitely gets the letter of the story. I just don't know if it necessarily gets the spirit of it for the most part.
Yeah, that was one of the notes I was taking. Like, for one of the scenes, like the one with the dog, it's basically verbatim. Like, they say every word, and the words that they don't say are the stage direction.
Yeah.
And like, that's a number of the scenes. And like, obviously sometimes they condense it, sometimes they shuffle the order around a bit, but for the most part, this is like a much more faithful adaptation than either of the ones that we've really gone through so far.
It makes sense that this is shown in English classes, because it does take so much verbatim from the story, but that doesn't necessarily a good adaptation make. Because thinking about the dog scene, like, while I was watching, it's just like, why did this have to be adapted particularly, especially since now I have to worry about what the fuck happened to that dog.
Oh no.
I think that's sort of why I wanted this version, this movie, to be my first introduction into into the Great Gatsby story so that I could sort of get the idea, the story, pretty much everything from the novel without having to read it.
That's fair. That's very fair.
Yeah.
I have seen, you know, the trailers and clips and memes of the 2013 version. So I
It's a
know it's
memeable
very.
movie.
I've even seen like a VFX breakdown. That's pretty cool
Ooh.
because like they completely VFX like the whole city in that movie. But I haven't seen the actual movie. I know it's very Baz Luhrmann. It's very flashy and
Yes.
the production design and the cinematography is the star of the show, not really
Yeah,
the
exactly.
story. Or...
With that said, I do still think it at least got to the heart of the story a lot more than this one did. At least me personally. Even though we definitely criticized the way it went about it a lot in the previous episode, even though I do and still very much enjoy it. As much as I definitely enjoyed it more than I did as a 16-year-old, there is just something that's so lifeless about this almost.
Yeah, that would be the wording I was thinking of. So like the last one, you sort of get like it's the Cliff Notes version of the story because Baz is more interested in the romance of the story, which is what the film is broadly about. This one, it's the more faithful adaptation, but that's all it is. It's sort of empty behind the eyes. It just kind of is
It's
saying
just
the
iron
things.
flat.
Yeah.
In spite of, again, I do think Mia Farrow gives the best performance in this movie, and she
And her line about rich girls don't marry poor boys, that's the line that stayed with me even like even after all this time. It's like that's the one scene I remember.
Yeah, and that is actually one of the few things that isn't in the novel at all, even though it definitely easily could have been. Like, once again, we do have an adaptation where what they do add in, it feels like it could have been part of it, which I do always find interesting.
Mia Farrow's acting her heart out in this movie. And this is actually the first project I've seen her in. So, of course, I've seen Bruce Dern and Redford and Sam Waterston in other projects. But this movie does make me want to, like, seek out other Mia Farrow performances. But I think the direction by Jack Clayton was a little lacking. And I think that's a big contributing factor to the word I felt was like dry.
It is very dry.
Yeah.
And this is not a story you want to be dry. You're supposed to really feel for these people. Like, and again, there's a lot about this I do like. I loved the opening. I do enjoy some of the scenes at the party. And I actually think that towards the end, it really was some of its stronger bits, especially for Sam Waterston, who I know can do a powerhouse performance because I spent a good chunk of my childhood watching him in Law & Order. Exactly. We know. Exactly. We know this man has a commanding presence, and somehow none of it is popping up on the screen, in spite of the fact that this is the version that definitely seems to be trying to emphasize, or at least tease, Daisy and Nick the most out of all of the ones I've seen. Which,
really?
What is it with Francis Ford Coppola and cousin incest? I just want to know.
Oh.
Yeah, they make much more of an emphasis on them kissing each other and her believing that she loves him.
Yeah. She flirts with him a lot more in this one. And again, like, it's Godfather Part 3 all over again. Francis Ford Coppola, what aren't you telling us, sir?
I think we want to know.
Well, in my notes I have, I guess it makes sense. They are from Kentucky.
Oh!
Bryan brought up earlier, the thing that kept, like, distracting me throughout it, so fucking Bruce Dern, because he is who he has to be in this movie, fucking Tom Buchanan, he's in these scenarios where it's like, he's supposed to be like this raw animal magnetism, you know, everyone's like fawning for this guy, but you know, it's no offense to the guy, but it's Bruce fucking Dern, so
he's whining for most of it. His performance is whining.
Even his entrance in the film is ridiculous, because he literally comes in on like a polo horse.
Yeah, but it's like, you know, like one of the notes I've put down was when he was having an affair with Marital, it just kind of Bruce Dern, sex icon and bewitcher of women. Like, like they're trying to sell this guy as being like, you know, just like this Don Juan, right? But, you know, he's just a guy.
He's just a guy, and again, the way he plays Tom is so whiny, which in fairness is what I think of Tom Buchanan, and I do enjoy seeing him being so pathetic, because fuck Tom Buchanan, of course. But it's not really what you're supposed to get out of that character. And speaking of that, why is it that half the time Gatsby enters...
How come I can't zero in on why this song sounds so sinister?
Because there's a silent menace to him. Like, even in the scene where he's talking to Daisy about the letter and about, like, how Daisy went through with marrying Tom after all, he keeps following her and she keeps backing away from him, and there's, like, this almost sign of quiet menace.
That is true.
He feels like he's second away from, like, snapping.
That is true, and Justin did point out he definitely comes off more as a thug in this movie, and I guess that's fair. Again, maybe I'm just letting the fact that I have always loved this character blind me a bit, but you're right.
Like even like in the confrontation, like obviously in the 2013 version, it's much more like physically violent, but in this one we have the indication that he was about to like sock him, but he stops himself. But like, you know, these quick cuts of him like kind of having this grimace and then like clenching his fist, and then Daisy runs off. But yeah,
that reads more psychological horror than anything.
Yeah,
maybe Redford thought that they were filming the horror version.
It wouldn't surprise me, actually.
No.
This is somewhat a secondary thing. I really wanted to bring it up more in the last one as well, but I can't think of his name. I'm so terrible with names. But the guy who played George in both of these movies are so well cast.
Oh, yeah.
Just so sad. They're just so upset with reality. And one of the standouts for me in this movie as well was their marital, the actress Karen Black. The thing I kept thinking of, we'll never be able to cover this, but one of my favorite books of all time is Flowers for Algernon. And the thing that...
another English book that we had to read.
And Karen Black would have been a fantastic fae.
Hey.
Just like this movie sort of like captures that energy that, you know, Faye captured in that book, but also in this movie where she wants so much more out of life. She feels trapped by this marriage with George and is sort of latching onto Tom because of the opportunity of what his money can bring her. But she also, you know, she breaks down crying because she sort of realizes how like empty her life is.
And then she just shatters that glass and there's just blood all over her fingers. I remember thinking that this feels like it's from a completely different movie, but again, now that we're kind of discussing the psychological horror vibes of this version, maybe not.
It's very fitting.
The actor for George, who I thought also did a really good job, especially as he's entering in the end. I know we want to go in chronological order, but when you skip to the end, when he's like stalking Gatsby, I thought was really good. The actor is Scott Wilson, aka Herschel Green from The Walking Dead.
Oh, although I don't know how I feel about the fact that Gatsby saw him coming, even though it wasn't actually towards him yet. They made a point of having him see George kind of marching off for revenge.
It just gives so much Death Seeker vibes, and I don't really know how I feel about that. Like, I think this works best with him being caught off guard, like, not seeing anyone coming.
Here he is just waiting to hear from Daisy, and all of a sudden, bang. I feel like that is a little bit more powerful. Yes, seeing the bomb under the table is more suspenseful, Mr. Hitchcock, but sometimes you don't want that.
One of the other things that I was noticing, so obviously we're bringing the 2013 version up because of like how much spectacle that's giving the party, because one of the contrasting parts is that Tom Buchanan's party kind of sucks, and as opposed to, you know, how much cooler Gatsby's is, because, you know, he's such a fly dude. But in this version, like when I was doing like the bit of research I could before this started, so I guess the director sort of had a different read on it, and like this is also what's sort of influencing my thug opinion. So in his mind, he thinks that Gatsby is kind of a phony. He's just sort of like throwing money at everything. So it's like, it doesn't really matter if the party sucks or not. So it's like the reason why so much of it kind of looks drab and boring, but, you know, people are still there, is the opulence of it is just him, you know, burning through his money. It's not exactly that he has any taste. It's just that he's paying someone to do it. He just fucking get it done.
And you see all the workers bringing in the food, setting up everything, and it just really shows that, like, it feels like Gatsby didn't really, like, put any thought into preparation. He just probably thought the bigger the better.
Which, I mean, I guess is certainly an interpretation. That is certainly a valid one. I don't know if it's necessarily my favorite one, but I could see why someone might think that he thinks that just throwing money at it would be enough to attract Daisy.
I didn't find the party scenes, like, I remember reading something like that about how the parties were supposed to be deliberately tasteless, but we were mentioning earlier how kind of dry and lifeless the movie feels, and the party scenes, like, the most exciting moment is when they start running through the fountain and dancing in it, and that was kind of a fun scene to watch. But I don't know, I just didn't really get a whole lot out of the party scenes. And I know, like, the party scenes are supposed to be, like, intense and chaotic. And there was that one moment that I liked where, like, there was a fight and it seemed to be like, oh, this is sort of expected. that people are going to get into fights at these parties just because of how crazy they are.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I did appreciate the fact that the guy who was making the fat shaming joke was the one who first got alcohol poured on him. That was weirdly satisfying.
I don't know, I just found it weirdly colorless.
I mean, yeah, like I said, it's just like, it was just a moment I was like, haha. But yeah, for the most part, the parties were just kind of meh, which given how Clayton saw it, I could see why he made that decision. I am just kind of debating if that is something that kind of fits into the spirit of the novel. Because, well, I mean, when you read the novel, Nick is not really having a good time ever at these parties, I feel like.
He just wants to go home, have a quiet night.
Yes, but my routine! But yeah, all these people are completely shallow and blah, but I still think at the very least, if it weren't for the people, he probably would still be out having a decent time, maybe.
I mean, like, even one of the establishing shots they have of Nick in this movie is like, you know, he's settling down, he's having a nice quiet night to himself, he's like opening up a book, and then like the fucking jazz orchestra like turns on.
Oh yeah, and then he sees like this red and white tent going up. It's almost circus-like.
I was thinking that. It's just like, what, did he hire a circus?
Yeah, and he's literally just having his dinner, and then, like, so all of a sudden jazz music just starts blaring, and he's like, can't I just have my dinner in peace?
Headphones haven't been invented yet. Leave me alone. But yeah, I do want to talk a bit about the music in this movie, because what I find interesting is that most of the movie, except for the scenes with Jay and Daisy, there's pretty much no score.
No.
Shamil and I covered the movie Passing a couple episodes back, and that also had a lot of moments with no score. That wound up working a lot better than it did in this movie. So why is it that in this movie it just makes the scenes seem awkward, while in Passing I feel like it added to the tension?
I'm thinking it's because of the way the shots are filmed. Like, you get a lot of like close-ups and far out, but they're always the characters are far and center for Passing. Whereas with this, it kind of feels like everyone's on the edges almost. There's like, everything is too spread out that you don't know what to focus on.
That is true. I never even thought of it that way. And it does kind of add to the awkwardness. It feels like when, you know, at the end when Nick is so upset about how things have turned out for Gatsby, it's like, okay, but you guys have barely spent any time up until the very end of his life. What the fuck?
It's very much like a tell not show kind of story in this adaptation.
This is just speculation on the director's part, just as a viewer, but I believe that the lack of score might have been to emphasize the parts where we do hear music, aka
the parties,
the opening, the parties. Yeah, anytime we hear that the Charleston or that song When You and I Were 17,
whenever Gatsby and Daisy are together.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, that was really the first time I really, other than some of that threatening music when Nick first sees Gatsby, that was really the first, like, piece of score I noticed during that moment where Daisy sees him through the mirror and they reunite.
I think the other moment that sort of captures what they want, just to kind of, like, preserve an amber, like this one moment is, it's when they're spending more time with each other, and Gatsby says, like, I'll do anything you want me to do. And she requests that he puts on his uniform, turn out all the lights, and they can dance around a candle. And it's just like this fairly long shot of the two of them dancing and sort of reminiscing. And if it were up to both of them, they would have been like that forever. That's all they ever wanted. But, you know, the night's gonna have to end eventually, yada yada. But I think that scene is the closest the movie comes to sort of capturing the point.
It's kind of interesting that they're dancing around the candle, because at the beginning of the movie, like when Nick comes outside, there's candles being lit on the patio, and Daisy goes, why are these candles out there? And she blows them out. I feel like there was trying to do some sort of symbolism there.
Yeah, and the thing is, that particular candle scene was in the book, while the one with Gatsby was not. So that was probably like directly from either Coppola or Clayton, who decided, okay, but she wants the candle with Gatsby. This seems to be a movie that very much ships it, which I do get. That is the center of the story, even though at the end of the day, the point is, no one should end up with anybody, really.
I don't know why, but the candlestick in that dancing scene, I thought it looked like it was matted in. Am I the only one that noticed that? I was watching the Blu-ray on a really big screen, so maybe I was just really focused on details like that.
Okay.
Nice.
Yeah. The thing I noticed in
mine we had was all blurry.
Yeah, the version I noticed on mine is, and this is a thing for like every single fucking 70s movie, but like soft focus all over the place.
Oh yeah.
And,
I noticed that too, especially on
terrible
Redford.
ADR. Just terrible ADR.
You noticed it when he said he was poor, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, what were you actually saying there? Because you definitely weren't saying poor there. The word poor does not look like that on people's lips, sir.
Well, it's a dubbing nightmare.
The subtitle said poor, but the words he said was something else. It was like...
Does anyone lip read here?
I forget what it was, but he said...
I get lost in his eyes. I can't... I don't know what Robert Redford said.
Fair. I feel bad for trashing his performance in this movie because I do like Robert Redford. I think he's very talented.
I think the whole look there does fit Gatsby, like the white suit.
Yeah. He looks the part, absolutely. Even if he is a little bit older than he probably should be, but...
Well, the same could be said for DiCaprio.
I mean, the same could be said for Nick. I mean, maybe just because I'm used to seeing Watterson be 80,000 years old, but...
it's
like,
so weird seeing him with dark hair.
Yeah.
Like, but, you know, he says he's 30. I'm like, you are 50. You are 45. There's no fucking way.
Not when you look like a borzoi. That was ages you.
If they filmed this in 73, he would be like 32, 33, so.
Yeah.
He was actually the right age for this. Oh my god.
Yeah.
It's that generation of people, like when you look at old football people, you see someone who's like age 22, physically 49.
I mean, the funny thing about that is up until like the 60s or 70s, good sunscreen just was not a thing. So
you're seeing all the wrinkles in like Redford's forehead, and he is just sweating in that room.
I mean, in fairness, I think they're supposed to be, but yeah, it's...
Yeah, that actually is the thing as well. So like most of this movie takes place over like, you know, this one summer in 22.
Yep.
And the thing I appreciated about it was, again, Shamila was saying, just how fucking like drenched everyone is. Because they didn't have air conditioning yet. They didn't have really any way of cooling themselves down. So they're just like sitting there baking in it.
It brings up like what Jordan was doing with Daisy, like on her wedding day. She just throws her in this freezing cold tub.
Yep, that was definitely something. I do actually really like that Daisy was the one who told that story in this version. Say what you will about this movie, it clearly cares about Daisy Buchanan.
Another casualty of both of these adaptations is still Jordan. I mean, we have more of Jordan in this movie as well, but she says the things she has to say and then she's out of the film.
Damn girl, give us nothing.
She's almost like a spectator, especially with the scene where she's saying, Nick, something about to go on, don't talk to me. I just want to hear this.
Like, she very much looks the part, arguably even more than Elizabeth Debicki did, but she's not really given anything. It's so interesting because, at least in my experience, people tend to really enjoy Jordan's character as they're reading it, and yet I so rarely see her depicted in an interesting way, at least in the film adaptations I've seen.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Nick being gone for a lot of the movie, but the characters that I noticed being missing for so much was first Jordan, and it sort of made me question, like, what is her purpose in this movie? Even in the Great Gatsby novel, because I haven't read it, but I don't really understand, like, the purpose of her character through this movie.
Yeah, in the book, it's more emphasized that she and Nick are kind of dancing around each other. They pretty much drop that whole thing, other than a throwaway line from Daisy trying to throw them together.
I think, if done right, she could have been a good Greek chorus.
Yeah, because she's clearly the one who knows everything that's going on. That's one thing that she and Nick have in common. They are the ones that know what's up. And I feel like you could really emphasize that in an adaptation.
Jordan, for me, at least in the book, and she's sort of another avenue for Nick into the life of, you know, the idle rich, like, you know, the whole bit of her being incredibly reckless, like she's a terrible driver.
Yep.
And she flaunts the fact she's a terrible driver because she just doesn't give a shit. And like in this movie, we have this bit of her kind of cheekily cheating during the golf tournament, and I recall that being a thing in the book as well.
Yeah. And Daisy just staring at her. It's like, I was just like, ooh, that is a gay look you're giving her, ma'am.
Yeah.
This is something that kind of like confused me for a little while in the movie, was that it was established early on that Jordan is a reckless driver. So later on, I got confused between Jordan and Daisy because Daisy was the one that hits Myrtle.
Yeah.
But it was never established that she's a bad driver.
That is true. Like, I think it's implied in the story and also in this that she was just so distraught, and also Myrtle had just kind of flung herself out.
Also, they've been drinking all day.
Yeah, like, this is definitely one thing that I think the 2013 movie did better. partially because they actually used flashbacks, and I feel like you really did need that, especially when it was revealed that Daisy was the one who hit her. As much as Sam Waterston is just born for solving crimes. But
Yeah, me and Jazz, like when we're sort of talking about it, this is behind the baseball, folks. When we were talking about it before we started recording, we both basically simultaneously had the same joke in our mind when he had the reveal, just kind of like, wait, Daisy did it. And it's just like, da-da!
Yes, and just insert
the gavel.
Yeah, insert the gavel, insert the big prosecutor speech that he's so very, very good at. Like I said, it's really only towards the end that I start recognizing Nick as a character, pretty much. Because, as you guys can probably tell, I do have a very great attachment to this story, partially because I have such an attachment to Nick and Gatsby's connection specifically. And not just because I'm a big old shipper, but because I do genuinely believe that in a story about just how isolating it can be to be surrounded by rich and careless people, they were really probably one of the few genuine connections in this story. And it is such a shame that all of that was kind of stuffed into the very end, even though I think it was done very well, but it was a little too late. Like, there was this scene where they take something directly from the very end of the book and they turn it into a conversation between Nick and Gatsby about, what early settlers must have thought of it, which of course there's issues with that too, which it would be
They
nice
must have been
for
afraid it would shy away as they're going to touch it.
Yeah, it is something that I feel like now that it is in the public domain, I would like to see future adaptations kind of address the fact that, yeah, those early settlers weren't just dreamers, guys.
They were colonizers.
And I mean, considering it is a story all about how the American dream is bullshit, it is kind of odd that people have kind of been dancing around part of why it is bullshit. But we'll get further into that when we do Self-Made Boys, because it at least tries to kind of address it, even though it also is trying to be a fic.
Yeah, we'll get more into it, but, the big takeaway from Self-Made Boys, for me at least, is in this adaptation of why the American dream is bullshit, we learned that the American dream is completely attainable, so long as you got your friends.
Yeah, basically. The American dream is attainable through the power of friendship.
It's very My Little Pony.
But anyway, back to the movie itself. With that said, I do still enjoy the fact that they actually had that conversation. I feel like it is a good show of both of their mindsets in a way. Like, in spite of the fact that Nick is definitely more realistic, I think he too is a dreamer, and that's part of why they connect. Like, just look at how he describes Gatsby within the text. I know, Brian, you haven't read it, but it is something to behold.
Like, there's a halo around him when he describes him.
When he first sees him, it's just, he really thinks of him as this larger-than-life, fascinating person from the get-go. And that, again, that's part of why his entrance does piss me off so much in this movie.
At the same time, it does feel like, in the movie at least, that if Nick wasn't literally living right next to Jay Gatsby, that he would have no involvement in Gatsby's life at all.
Oh yeah, absolutely not. No, he was definitely dragged into it.
Kicking and screaming if it weren't for Gatsby himself.
Here's the question I have, though, about Nick, and maybe it says it in the book, but in the end, after Gatsby's death, when Mr. Gad shows up at the mansion, like, Nick is dressed in nice clothing. And to me, it implied that Gatsby left the mansion to Nick. Is that correct? Or am I...
We never do find out what happens to Gatsby's assets. No, it would have made sense if that had ended up happening. But no, we never really find out what happens with that.
Because I think it would have had that happened if Gatsby had left the mansion to Nick. I don't know. I think that would have said something about this, like, American dream and how it's sort of like, because there was talk early on during the party where Tom is walking through the party and he's saying, oh, this person, his father has oil, and this person, his father owned drugstores or whatever. And there was a lot of talk about how wealth is sort of passed down nepotistically from generation to generation. And how if Gatsby had left his assets to Nick, I don't know, it just would have been interesting to analyze. I guess that's all I can say.
That is true. That's actually an interesting thing that I'm surprised no one's ever tried to do, and at least that I know of.
Editor Jasmine here. I did give what Bryan said a little bit more thought, and while I do still agree it would be interesting for a version of The Great Gatsby to go in this direction. I think I understand why people haven't done that. It just leaves to almost happy of a note for what is intended to be a tragic story about how unattainable the American dream is unless you were born wealthy. And I certainly don't blame Bryan for missing it because he had never read the book. And the final passage in the book is not in the movie at all. It just ends on he could not see that it was already behind him. So we don't get the Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and then one fine morning, we beat on, boats against the current borne back ceaselessly into the past. And there's just something about Nick inheriting Gatsby's wealth that feels like it would undercut that point. However, I will say I'm still not against the idea of an adaptation taking this route, so I would have to insist that any creator that went that route made it very clear it's a Pyrrhic victory, because no matter how wealthy he is, it's not going to bring his friend back. It still needs to end with that bittersweet note, if you ask me anyway. And now back to the podcast.
What happens in the book and also in the 2013 movie is that Nick actually has this whole conversation with Gatsby about the war and then only finds out that he's talking to his host. I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host. And he smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with the quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant, then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just so far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that, at your best, you hoped to convey.
Precisely at the point it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or two over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. Some time before he introduced himself, I got a strong impression that he was picking his words with care.
Like, this is his first impression of the man. And Bryan, as someone who this was his first introduction to the story, did you get any of that from the first scene they were together?
I do remember him saying that line, "I'm afraid I'm not a very good host."
Yeah, they did keep that.
But that just shows how lackluster it is if that's the only thing you can remember.
Could you spark notes for me exactly what you mean by the introduction in the book versus this movie?
Of course. So the movie, he's actually just called up to his room and immediately knows that he is Gatsby, and it's just kind of this awkward conversation, an awkward introduction, versus, again, they connect over their shared trauma of the war, even though they don't say it that way because it's the 20s. And then he finds out it's Gatsby, and he has this flowery description of his first impression of just his smile.
So he's smitten by Gatsby in the book, basically.
Understatement.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't even mean it like that, but yeah.
Yeah, no, you could technically, yes, you could absolutely read it as he's just very fascinated by him in a not gay way, but it's very easy to read it in a gay way as well.
I'll give you my interpretation. I think what that awkward meeting meant to me as a viewer, and what I think the movie was trying to do, which is that it seemed to me as if Gatsby, through the movie, of course, wasn't very close to a lot of people. And for whatever reason, Jay decided to pick his next door neighbor to be his best friend. And so what I got from the movie was that Nick was basically there because Gatsby's so isolated in this mansion, he doesn't even go to his own parties. Nick is there to, I guess, support this kind of lonely rich man. Nick kind of takes pity on this kind of awkward, lonely rich guy. And, he's kind of awkward that first time. That's why he's like, "Can I go now?" Sort of at the end of their conversation.
Yeah.
But as the movie goes on, that relationship is still there, or that feeling that wow, I take a lot of pity on this guy is still there, but he gets better at just sort of sitting there and being quietly supportive, in the scene where in the hotel room where Gatsby and Daisy tell Tom that they want to be together. That was just sort of my reading of the movie, and I'm sure it's different from the book, of course. It's just a different way. I don't know if that one is necessarily better than the other. It's just one way of establishing the relationship between Gatsby and Nick.
And That's very fair. That's a very fair way of looking at it, because at the core of it, yes, there's definitely that instance of taking pity on this lonely rich guy and trying to support him. It's basically just the difference between it's always just kind of awkward versus he's kind of hero worshipping him, and then he learns more about him. That's also kind of part of it. We never really hear much about Gatsby's backstory in this version. Meanwhile, that's a very major plot point in the novel and in the 2013 film.
The most we really get is like from his father, and like he talks obviously a little bit about his exploits in the war and yada yada, but yeah, we don't really get a sense of like how much of a struggle this was for him until he's already dead.
Well, I got the impression that Gatsby's backstory is always kind of mysterious, because first it's he's related to Kaiser Wilhelm, then it's he owns drugstores, then it's oil bootlegging. Oh, he went to Oxford. Oh no, he didn't. Or maybe he kind of did. Maybe he went there, but he didn't graduate. It's just the story always keeps changing, and I thought that's kind of on purpose. I figured that was probably something straight from the novel.
It is,
but
but
normal, yeah.
It is, but then it doesn't get its resolution, basically. In the novel, you do get definitive answers, basically.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. But
what
again,
is that answer?
basically that he was just this poor kid in South Dakota, ran away from home, and ended up stumbling upon this drunk millionaire helping to save his life, and therefore he ended up kind of learning how to play the rich man with him, and then he died, but he didn't end up
and
getting
then he made his money bootlegging.
Because he was supposed to inherit something from that man, but his family kind of cheated him out of it, and then he went to the war, and then he was bootlegging. So yeah, we don't really learn a lot about... We never get the resolution to all those rumors in the film, which, like you said, one isn't inherently better than the other, but I do think we kind of lose part of the whole point of Gatsby's character when we lose that.
So does all of that happen after his relationship with Daisy from before? It had said that like, oh, he was a poor guy when he first met Daisy.
Yeah.
And then he became rich. And the idea of him becoming rich, like he did that purposefully just so that he could be able to marry Daisy.
More or less.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he had the exploits with the rich drunk. He learned basically how to move within rich society, but then he didn't get any of the money, and so he needed a different way of making a living, which is why he enlisted. He did very well in the war. He became an officer, and it was because he was an officer that he met Daisy at all.
Yep.
And after meeting Daisy, he sort of course corrected his entire life to try to hold on to this, even though he wanted to become more learned, which is why he did actually go to Oxford, yada yada.
He did all of that in 5 years?
Yeah.
Wow.
The 20s were a different time. Yep, it's 8 in this one for some reason. But it is fair to point out that just because it's different from the book doesn't inherently make it less good, of course. It's just, at least for me, again, it takes the letter of so much of this book, but then we end up losing kind of the most important parts, in my opinion.
Less practical adaptation.
Oh, less practical? How?
Oh no, because usually in an adaptation you would want to streamline it. Like there are parts of the book where it would not be relevant, like the dog scene, like you mentioned. It doesn't really add anything to the story. It's almost...
I mean, I wonder if maybe just the fact that Tom was able to just casually throw $10, which, what was $10 in 20s money? Let me look that up, actually.
Well, if 80 was about $1,000.
All right, so yeah, that is almost $200, which makes sense because that's more or less how much some dogs cost. So I guess maybe the point was to see that he could easily throw away $200 onto his mistress.
For me, because both of them eventually, again, it sort of is an example of how reckless they are with the lives of others. So he buys this dog as a lark, basically, because Myrtle asks him to. He ends up stepping on the fucking thing.
Yeah. I mean, in fairness, that wasn't in the book, I don't think, but
it was not.
But
we do never see the dog again, so...
There's like a few lines like sporadic about like, you know, an empty like dog bowl, like, you know, the food that they were given with the dog is like left in the water dish. So it's like he buys it to impress Myrtle, but neither of them really wanted the dog. They just sort of wanted the fact they could do it. And then after it was done, they don't give a shit anymore. So they basically abandon this dog. Again, it's sort of showing how both of these people are reckless and unempathetic towards, you know, life.
Okay, that's fair. I could definitely see that. Yeah, I don't think this, for one of the few adaptations that actually addresses this moment, they don't really make good
Do
use of
anything
it.
with it, no.
Exactly.
I mean,
No.
They could have made some good use of it, other than the fact there is a diamond leash that George finds after Myrtle's death.
Okay, that's what I wanted to ask about. This diamond bedazzled leash that George finds. Does that have anything to do with the dog that we saw earlier?
It's supposed to.
Okay.
Basically, the dog is just an extravagant purchase, and that it's little else. Like, it's not even like seen as a living being. I think it's like they're not going to take accountability or responsibility for it. So
not that different.
So
from Penny.
Tom got the leash for Myrtle.
Yes.
Yes.
But did Myrtle keep the dog?
I mean, that's the thing. We never really do find out what happened to that dog.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like,
she doesn't keep it with George. I think it might be in the apartment she lives in that Tom bought her.
Yeah.
But for the most part, they basically, the dog only matters insofar as that Tom bought it on a lark, and it's the sort of gifts that he would just throw at Myrtle.
Along with the bloody nose.
And hey, this is an adaptation that kept the domestic violence. Woo!
Yay! I mean, in fairness, so did the 2013. Like, they never shy away from making Tom a violent asshole.
Speaking of Tom, I thought Bruce Dern did a really good job, and I totally believed that he was this racist white supremacist. Like, there's that whole line about how... I'm assuming that's from the book as well?
Oh, yeah.
It is.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about it last time. It's actually based on a real book that's written by a Ku Klux Klan member. It's pretty cool.
What's interesting to me is how far back the whole white replacement theory goes.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, yeah.
We talk about that like it's a new thing, but like it seems to have been
always
around
been
for
there.
a while.
It's always been there.
I said the previous episode, that passage aged backwards since I was in high school, and I hate it.
Yeah, it's more relevant now than
it was in...
Probably was back in the 70s.
Yeah, probably.
Well, I mean, the conservatives nowadays are going after same-sex marriage, so, they'll eventually go against V-Love as well.
Oh, absolutely.
So, hey, here comes issues of miscegenation, folks. It's not over yet. No. It's 100-year cycle. We're going to do it all again.
Mildred vs. Loving was in the 60s. It wasn't even that long ago.
No. We very much take that sort of thing for granted, but it's so fragile.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, this is behind-the-scenes information, but, my coworkers talk about how, I don't see what's so wrong. Like, why? People have been like, civil rights was so long ago. I mean, like, what's the problem? And like, it's my guy. School integration happened so recently. The people who went to those schools haven't even fucking retired yet.
Ruby Bridges is only 68.
My father was born like 4 years after MLK died.
Clarence Thomas is going to go after miscegenation so he can divorce his wife.
Yes.
Yeah. But like, it doesn't even matter if civil rights was 100 years ago or 50 years ago. Like, they're trying to bring child labor back when that was outlawed 100 years ago.
Fucking did it.
Yeah.
I guess this is a perfect time to ask, why does this story endure?
The cycle of hoping for a better life, hoping for more than what you are and what your current circumstances are.
Because, sort of an abridged version of what I said last time, but it is a universal story of people making terrible mistakes in their 20s that then ruin the rest of their fucking lives.
Oh, that hit hard.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's a good question. It's something that I was asking myself while I was watching the movie, and also like after finishing it and sort of reflecting back on what I just watched. And there is that one scene that I thought was really getting at the theme, which was where Nick says to Gatsby, like, you can't go back to the way things were. And Gatsby stops and turns around and he says, of course you can. And I feel like why it endures is that all of us have that sense of nostalgia, that sense of wanting to go back to a different time, a better time. It's interesting that this takes place during the 20s, because I always thought that people were nostalgic for the 20s because of the flapper dresses and, the economic prosperity.
But they miss a lot of the ugliness that was in the 20s as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because The Great Gatsby was not a successful novel when it first came out. It only came out about 2 years after the book itself takes place. It was only during World War II that it started.
1925.
Yep, 1925 rather, sorry.
Yeah.
So, and it was only during World War II that people started looking at it because they were nostalgic for the 20s.
I forget its like initial reaction, but it's like it was a contemporary book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then 15 years later, the whole fucking economy imploded. And so people are like, oh, well, we can't read the F. Scott Fitzgerald book because it reminds us of when things were cool and they suck right now, and he sucks. And he sort of languished throughout, to the end of his life as this not despised author, but, people sort of looked down on his work because, oh, he was the guy who wrote the Great Gatsby.
Oh,
And
but
then
speaking of his writing, like, do you remember there were a lot of like things that he's stolen from his wife Zelda?
Yes,
that
yes. We really should address that. It's taken us far too long to address that part.
Yeah.
And then, after it gained popularity again in the 40s, it was recapturing the ineffable past because of just like, oh, well, times were good then. They're not great now, but hey, look, it worked once.
And what's interesting
But
is
also,
that's not even the point of the novel.
No, but history does repeat when you keep making the same mistakes. And now in the new 20s, we're getting a pandemic, just like when they had the Spanish flu in the 20s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does kind of miss the point of the novel if you're looking at it as something that enjoys the 20s, if you will. As the t-shirt says, ain't no party like a Gatsby party, and because a Gatsby party don't stop until at least 2 people are dead, and we're all disillusioned by the jazz age overall.
Yeah, it seems to be that The Great Gatsby revels in nostalgia while also being a criticism of nostalgia.
It's almost like a cautionary tale of sorts.
Oh, it's absolutely a cautionary tale.
And like, in the wrap up last time, even brought up like the whole, this book being incredibly prescient because again, it came out during this period before everything went to hell. And like, even within this narrative, it's like, this thing is incredibly fragile, guys. We can't exactly base, society on this forever because these idle wealthy who'll smash up anything they can grab and then hide away in their money will get away with everything. And then it happened, and then it keeps happening for a century.
And the fact that Nick is selling bonds, like, he, of all the characters, would know that the careless wealthy are gonna ruin everything.
Capitalism at its finest.
Whee!
Also, it does, with Tom's line about race and everything, a lot of, like, the influences during the jazz age, especially with the flapper dresses and everything and the hairstyles, they were all stolen from black people.
Ain't it always the way? As much as our culture hates black people, we sure do love to steal all the cool shit.
What are you talking about? Tom said the whites invented everything.
You couldn't even do it. You couldn't even do it for the bit. I can't blame you. I can't blame you.
It's because I'm a petite blanc, I'm not one of the Nordics, Phil, the Irish stock, it's...
Yeah.
It's a thing we're going to talk about a bit when we get to Self-Made Boys.
Yes.
Gatsby admits to being Irish in that one. I'm like, hey, guess you're more considered white than either.
Yeah.
Something that Shamila mentioned earlier was that this Daisy reminded her of Blanche Dubois. And what's interesting is that Tennessee Williams actually thought that this movie was better than the book.
Oh.
Interesting.
Yeah. He said, "It seems to me that quite a few of my stories, as well as my one-acts, would provide interesting and profitable material for the contemporary cinema, if committed to. Such cinematic masters of direction as Jack Clayton, who made of The Great Gatsby a film that even surpassed, I think, the novel by Scott Fitzgerald."
I enjoy your plays, Mr. Williams' Ghosts, but I don't know if we're going to agree on that.
And I wonder if that's because he saw so much of Blanche in Mia Farrow's Daisy that he was like, wow.
Yeah, it was kind of giving me a little bit of Ophelia vibes with the haunting, esoteric look.
Oh yeah, and honestly, some of her like meltdowns, which are definitely not in the book, that also kind of gives more Ophelia vibes. You're not wrong there. Like, I meant to bring that up. It's interesting how the confrontation ends with her out and out screaming and running off rather than her just kind of locking herself away and then Gatsby being like, come on, let's go. Like, she's out and out, just bolts out of the hotel. Like, you
She's
definitely
just falling
get
apart at the seams visually.
You do get the sense that they interpreted Daisy as on the edge of sanity.
Which, considering her life, I don't exactly blame her.
Yeah, again, I've always had a lot of sympathy for Daisy, no matter how despicable she can be.
Yeah, as I was watching this, and I was sort of watching Daisy and Tom and even Myrtle through Nick's eyes, I was just kind of like, these people are nuts.
You're not wrong.
And like, is that typical of Great Gatsby adaptation?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there's a reason Nick out and out says they're a rotten crowd. You're worth 10 of them. Like, he, by this point, and it's not really demonstrated very well in this movie, I feel like, that Nick is just
he ends up leaving, like, West Egg out of disgust.
Well, yeah, but no, it's just more, like, even before Gatsby's dead, he's just done with everyone.
No more drama in my life.
I've had it with all of you.
Well, I think it goes back to sort of what I was saying earlier about Nick kind of being the support for Gatsby. Especially in that scene where Nick is telling Gatsby, like, maybe you should go away for a while until this all blows over. Still there, even when Daisy and Gatsby have killed a woman, Nick is still there for Gatsby at least.
Ride or die.
Again, it's one of the reasons why people absolutely read it as him being unrequitedly in love with him. Like, he sticks with him. He's the only one he sticks with, really. He rejects basically everybody else.
Yeah, that makes sense. And especially when you look at the not relationship between Jordan and Nick. I mean, it's just like...
Very functionary.
Yeah. It's sort of like, hey, our friends are shipping us together, but we're not really into each other.
Like, the book definitely makes it seem like more it's kind of a thing, but it's never, like, fully a thing in the book. And it's even less so in this movie. Like, I don't think any film adaptations really ever tried to make it actually a thing.
How would you make it a thing? That's the question.
I mean, the thing is, like, Hollywood has never shied away from over-romanticizing what doesn't need to be romanticized. So it is interesting how rarely we see Nick and Jordan actually seeming romantic. I mean, spoiler alert, but the Muppets Present the Great Gatsby, it very much romanticizes Nick and Jordan.
The song that just popped into my head about the relationship between Nick and Jordan is that nice, the romantic ERM song, the one I love, a simple prop to occupy my time. This one goes to the one I love.
You know. I see it. I see the vision.
I would like to see a version of the Gatsby where I just see a point to having Jordan in the Gatsby story, because I still like just don't understand her purpose, because
she is friends with Daisy, but we never see much of their friendship other than the shallowness of them going to parties together. Like, I do think that Daisy, watching Jordan and cheating during her match and giving her that look, it's the most intimate we've ever seen them.
Like you said, this is your first run with Gatsby. I very much can see why you think Jordan does nothing in this.
This movie does make me want to seek out other adaptations of Gatsby. Yay. Maybe even the original book.
It's 100 pages, so, I mean...
Oh, really?
Yeah, no, it's actually a very short little book, which makes it kind of interesting how both of the major film adaptations are over 2 hours.
Well, the audiobook is 4.5 hours, right?
It is, yeah. The audiobook is about 4.5 hours, but keep in mind, most full-length novels can run from, 6 to 10 hours.
Yeah. And all depending on, font size. 100 pages could be a little, it could be a lot. Who knows?
Yeah. Fair.
But I would like to... Tiny. I also like to read the original Coppola script for this, because he said it didn't really follow it.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Screen directions could provide some context.
Could.
Yeah.
They could.
A funny story about Coppola's involvement is that basically after he finished The Godfather, he had convinced himself that it was going to fail at the box office. And so he took this job of writing The Great Gatsby based on a recommendation from Robert Redford. And because he thought he was going to need money after The Godfather bombed. And so he's in a hotel room in Paris writing this Great Gatsby adaptation, and his wife calls him and is like, there's lines around the block for The Godfather in New York City. And he's like, yeah, but I've got to finish this Gatsby script.
Oh, that's amazing.
So, spent 2 or 3 weeks writing this Gatsby script, and he couldn't even celebrate his success of The Godfather because he was stuck writing this script.
Talk about irony.
And then later he says the director didn't even pay any attention to it.
Oh.
So
Yeah, that's part of the framing and like how drab and kind of dry everything is. That one of his complaints is that isn't in the script. That's just the director's interpretation of the work.
Yeah, because I was surprised because Coppola is not a boring writer in the slightest.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny to me is you mentioned the bomb under the table, but that scene where we're meeting Wolfsheim in the dinner scene, for whatever reason, it reminded me of the scene in the restaurant in The Godfather with the bomb under the table and like the gangsters sitting around it, you know. One of the actors, he looked familiar to me, and usually I have to like Google people to like find out like who they were.
I think I know who you're talking about.
Who do you think I'm talking about?
Edward Herrmann?
No.
Oh, yeah, no, because he is briefly in this. I was like, Richard Gilmore, what are you doing here?
Wait, from Gilmore Girls?
Yes. Yeah. Edward Herrmann is in this movie as Klipspringer. And Ain't We Got Fun does return to this story. So that's nice. So which actor were you thinking of?
I was thinking of the actor who plays Mr. Gatz, Robert Blossom.
Oh.
And without even needing to Google it, just hearing his voice, I was like, oh, that's Old Man Marley from Home Alone.
Oh!
Yeah.
Oh my God!
This is all of 6 degrees.
Right?
Oh my God. But yeah, I should mention the use of Ain't We Got Fun in this, because it is actually directly referenced within the novel, and I had mentioned that for how much they used music in the 2013 film, I was a little bummed out there was nothing there, especially since some of the lesser known lyrics do fit the theme so well. But then the monkey's paw finger curled, because then we go from the solemn ending to the giggly little performance of it in the end credits, and I was just like,
yeah, I hated that so much.
I hate it when movies do that.
Way to take your audience out of the moment, you know.
Like, you could maybe make the argument that it's trying to be satirical about it. It's just like isn't it fun? But I feel like a sadder, slower version of it would have been much more appropriate, because, again, you have, like, the lyrics about the rich get rich and the poor get children, or the poor get laid off. Again, that was directly quoted in the novel. So it would be really nice if a version of this story could finally, like, actually put that song to good use. Any final thoughts?
Someone make this into a horror movie. This would be fascinating to see.
I think someone is going to listen to this and write it
and go,
yeah.
May we provide inspiration for all you fellow writers.
Yes, that's definitely part of what I want to do here. Not only do I want people to expand their horizons, I would love for somebody to take the prompts that we are offering here and write something I could read or watch.
It is interesting to me that when it comes to The Great Gatsby, there isn't a definitive film version like there is with other stories like To Kill a Mockingbird or Francois Truffaut's Fahrenheit 451. Like, the one people most know about, interestingly, is the Leonardo DiCaprio version,
and that's
probably because that's the most recent one,
and that's divisive as hell, as we discussed in the previous one.
And there was a silent version, like, it did come out in the 1920s, and there was also something in the 1940s.
But the silent film is actually a lost film, unfortunately. The only evidence we have that it existed is a trailer. But apparently,
also F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda saying they fucking hated it.
Yeah, that was what I was about to say. They apparently did not like that movie.
There was a 2000 version.
Yes, there was, and it was the TV miniseries with Paul Rudd. So something about bug-based superheroes just attracts the character of Nick Carraway.
If I had a nickel for every time a Marvel superhero played Nick Carraway, I just have to. Not a lot, but it's where that's happened.
But it's better than happen twice, right?
There was a graphic novel too.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me at all. Like, there's a whole bunch of Spark Notes graphic novels and just other. Like, I've read a few Shakespeare graphic novels. We might get into those eventually. But anyway,
a video game.
What?
It's a hidden object game called Classic Adventures: The Great Gatsby. It's like an 8-bit style online game.
Oh my god. Justin, did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I can combine the two. My final thoughts and shout out, since I did my George Wilson build last time, is since this adaptation took place when it takes place in, I did the macabre thing I always do, and I just want to say rest in peace to Jack Clayton, Scott Wilson, Karen Black, Robert Blossom, Howard De Silva, and Edward Herrmann. All of them have passed since this movie premiered.
That's sad about Robert's Blossom. You know, it was that sort of soft voice that he has when he's talking about his son. Just reminds me of the church scene when he speaks to Kevin from Home Alone.
Yeah, I could see it.
Yeah. His voice is just so calming. And anyway.
Yeah, he was very well cast. All right, so who's got stuff to plug?
You can find me at s4karuna@tumblr.com. I do collective lists of representation in film, like Indigenous women in historical period pieces, and girls' love series from around the world.
Bryan, you have anything to plug?
I am B. Harris Film on Instagram and on Facebook. But yeah, thank you for having me on this episode of Three People Explain the Great Gatsby to me.
It was kind of that.
Yeah.
I love that.
We'll have it as a subtitle.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It's, part of it is to kind of make people more aware of these sorts of things too. Like, again, expanding horizons.
And I love getting people to talk about the things that they are passionate about. So it was great to see all of you, explaining the Great Gatsby novel to me.
Yeah, definitely.
And as always, you can find me at Favor Vieira on Twitter, Tumblr, and TikTok. Additionally, I have started a Twitter account for Inich Retelling. Please follow us at IER Podcast. And once again, Shamila Karanakaran's GoFundMe is still up. Please donate if you can. She is still trying to recover from the employment fraud she endured.
Coming up next week, Shamila and I are going to be discussing the very first advanced reader copy we ever received, A Drop of Venom by Sunji Patel. A YA retelling of the Medusa myth with an Indian folklore twist. Don't you dare miss it. And remember, stories gain power in each retelling. And I'm really, really grateful I finally got to release this episode.
I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him.
Every morning, every evening, ain't we got fun? Not much money, oh but honey, ain't we got fun?
And as I sat there, brooding on the old, unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He didn't know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch our arms out further, in one fine morning. And so he beat on, boats against the current, bore back ceaselessly into the past.